On va commencer avec Olivia.
I will do the presentation in English if it's fine, but I can answer questions in French or switch to French in case there are any problems. So I will also interrupt the flow in the Teams because in this presentation I'm going to focus on the entanglement between medicine and the law in the regulation of gender recognition in France and Italy. So the paper that I'm going to present, yes, it's part of my wider postdoc project, which looks at the biopolitics of trans health, and particularly at the way the negotiations between different social actors have shaped the development of trans biomedicine and healthcare in France and Italy. And I will focus particularly on the third research axis, which is particularly focused on the medical legal arrangement that regulate gender recognition. So the wider background of the presentation is this. Nowadays in Europe, medical knowledge and technologies are still central to the procedures for legal gender recognition. That means that in 36 European states, a psychiatric diagnosis is demanded in order to access the fact of change in one's first name and legal gender. And in 36 of them, also medical procedures, including sterilization, are demanded. What's the situation in Italy and France? Nowadays, in Italy, the law which we are going to talk about, which is the 164, regulates the possibility to change gender marker and first name on the basis of lawsuits. And one have to have been diagnosed as gender dysphoric and also have undergone medical procedures, including hormonal treatments. Up to 2015, when two verdicts of the Constitutional and Supreme Court established that surgeries cannot be considered as requirement for legal gender change, they were also prerequisites for gender recognition. In France, a legal vacuum that, as we'll see, was quite intentional, has prevailed until very recently, that is November 2016, when a law, which is a paragraph of a wider law on justice, has been approved that established that one can change first name through filing an application to the town council, and gender marker through an application to the district court, that is the Tribunal de Grande Instance. The fact of not having a diagnosis or medical procedure cannot be per se a reason for exclusion or rejection, but as we'll see, things are done in practice, and so we are going to see how the law actually applies. But up until this date, based on jurisprudence that had been developing since the 70s, gender affirming genital surgeries and a diagnosis of transsexualism were required to change one's first name and gender, or at least in most of the district courts where the processes went through. So in the presentation, I'm going to focus particularly on a process that, culminating in the 1980s and 90s, led to France and Italy to develop two specific arrangements that regulated the procedure for legal gender change up to these recent developments. Because I argue that such arrangement provide the frame and the path within which further development has arrived. I'm an historian, and I think that history really helps tackle innovation, recent innovation. So first I'm going to look at how the problem, the condition of the problem of legal gender change emerged, and then I'll see how it's been tackled in France and Italy, and then try to go through some conclusion that are provisionary. So transmedicine emerged in Europe, in Western transmedicine emerged in Europe in the 20s and 30s, basically in Germany and in UK, where procedures that were used for other goals were applied to feminize and masculinize the bodies of those who sought them. That's the big innovation. So the technology per se were not particularly innovative, but their usage was innovative. But it's only in the 50s that this went public. In fact, the so-called sex change by Kristen Jorgensen, that you can see on the right, made the issue of sex change public and really, in a way, triggered a big demand for this kind of technologies and procedures. And that's the moment when the issue pops out in medical journals in Italy and France too. So you can see an abstract of an article by endocrinologist Vaghi that really shows how this demand was really strong. On the other hand, it was not welcomed with benevolence in the medical community at the time. First of all, most of physicians thought it was kind of experimental, at least malpracticed as worse, and also the legal framework of the time could sanction this kind of procedure, especially genital surgery. In fact, modifying healthy genitals was considered as maiming or castration, and as such it was punished. So while for hormonal treatments it was easier in a way to find compliant physicians or pharmacists, as for surgeries, many people have to go abroad. Many people in France and Italy have to go abroad. You can see the main destinations for surgery. And often they would come back and ask for a legal gender change. So what was the framework at the time for this kind of procedure? The possibility to change one legal gender was only possible through a lawsuit, but only in the case that the gender assignation was considered mistaken. So it was a frame that was mainly applied to intersex people who would later decide to ask for a change in the gender marker. In general, trans people and gender diverse people tended to be excluded from this framework. But in the 60s and 70s in Italy, if we look at Italy, some mavericks Italian courts started to afford legal gender change also for trans and gender diverse people who were not intersex. So the rationale for this was, one, that sex determination was in a way a complex procedure that relied on a balance between different elements, including psychological sex, as expert witness would say. On the other hand, the preoccupation was with public order. So the fact of showing in public while being registered as another gender could be not fine for public order. But this manifestation of benevolence was interrupted in 1979 when the Constitutional Court was interrogated in order to know if there was actually a right to be recognized in one's identity, and the Constitutional Court said that no, the legal framework wouldn't allow it. This triggered the emergence of one of the first, I would say, trans movements in the Western world, or at least in Europe, that first show up with the spectacular action in a swimming pool in Milan, where some trans women showed up with the female swimming suit that's showing their breasts, and this action that went public on TG newspapers, etc., ignited the emergence of the movement. It's important to stress that This movement relied on direct action and was actually very engaged in the public arena. It recognized itself in the tradition of liberation movements and civil rights movements, and in fact it was endorsed by the Italian Radical Party, which was a liberal party to which many feminist and homosexual groups were affiliated. And it's not it's not for chance that this was the party who first presented a bill that responded. I forgot to say that the Constitutional Court has said in this legal framework it's not possible to recognize trans people gender, but the legislator should do something. And so the Radical Party decided to do that something and proposed a bill that was very simple and that limited itself to say that the possibility to change one personal data was also possible when the reality does not match anymore the data registered at birth. So the bill was very simple and didn't even mention transsexualism, sex change, or anything of that. In the proponent's intention, it was just intended to supply to the situation of those who had been operated abroad, but in a certain way, it was very broad and it didn't require any requirement. The bill had a very low profile, but the trans movement outside the parliament presented the issue of legal gender recognition as an issue of freedom, of the right to fully develop one personality, of social justice. In the parliament, the issue was discussed, the issue of freedom was left out of the conversation, and the issue was discussed as a law that would accommodate a marginalized population that was very small. Nonetheless, the government party, that is the Christian Democratic Party, at a certain moment found out that something big was being discussed in the parliament, or in the parliament, and so insisted that halted the discussion and insisted that why they didn't have any moral objection to the approval of a law. Nonetheless, it was necessary to discipline the cases in which a sex change can be allowed and to establish the methods through which it should be verified. This, they said, would safeguard the interest of the individual while at the same time defending the essential values of the community and the continuation of the humankind. So central to this project of establishing some procedures to control such a phenomenon was the issue of the medical consultation. In fact, the bill that was proposed by a DC member, Rossi, as a counter bill against the other one was based on the fact that legal gender change could be afforded only in the case of irreversible transsexualism. And this had to be ascertained through medical legal testimony. The Rossi's bill was never approved, but the law that came out of the merging of the two bills, that was finally in '82, the law which is still in place nowadays, has conserved in a certain way the logic of this bill. In fact, it established that legal gender change can be allowed only once sexual characteristics have been modified, and in case of necessity, after a psychosexual, medical legal testimonies that ascertain the psychosexual condition of the applicant. So we can see that the particular role conferred to medicine in the regulation of gender transition was very explicit and was also reinforced by a constitutional a verdict of the Constitutional Court, which in 1985 reaffirmed the constitutionality of the bill on the basis of the fact that psychosexual identity had to be granted and was constitutionally protected as a right to health. So in a certain way, as a consequence of the of the interpretation of this law. On the one hand, we witnessed the formation of official trans healthcare services in the in the public service. On the other one, gender recognition was bounded to medicine. This has not changed except for surgery up to nowadays. In the French context, the situation is completely opposed in a certain way. First of all, because the actors involved in the process were completely different. While the trans movement was, or organization engaged in trans issues were out there already, but they were mainly involved in mutual support and service provision. So they didn't act as advocacy group. On the other hand, we saw the medical community, which was, on the other hand, very active. Since 1969, some medical legal experts started to provide an argument for the fact that legal gender affirming surgeries, hormonal therapies, were in fact therapeutic. In '79, they started convincing the General Medical Council of this issue. They were allowed to perform the first official genital surgeries. This boundary work that these physicians were actually doing was very convincing, and was also convincing in a certain way for the legal expert community that was active at the time. In fact, we can see that at the end of the 70s, some legal gender change started to be afforded, and at the beginning of the 80s, some experts talked about a real turning point in jurisprudence. But medical experts consider legal gender change the final point of a therapeutic pathway that they were constructing, because in a certain way what they said was if gender-affirming surgeries have to be afforded only in the case when this can take the person out of the marginality and make them a productive citizen in a certain way, if legal gender change don't happen, then this won't happen. So in a certain way, legal gender change was embedded in the therapeutics. On the other hand, physicians were very open and clear on the fact that a law should not be approved. Why? This is very clear in a passage of the statement that was approved by the Academy of Medicine in 1982, where a physician would say it is necessary to officialize, yes, I'm going to the point, to officialize the practice that this multidisciplinary team that starting with Paris were popping up in different cities, and it's necessary to recognize their work. Why? Because they can be a boundary to an uncontrolled diffusion of a phenomenon which is, I quote, evidently very bad for our society. A law, approving a law, the situation that would have created was that of recognition of a social a social importance of a phenomenon. While what physician would proclaim was that leaving the issue to doctors and judges would allow a better control of the phenomenon. Actually, this legal vacuum was actually put in place because once the discussion about the possibility to insert a legal paragraph on legal gender change in the bioethical laws of the 90s was explicitly excluded for these reasons that were presented by physicians, and the issue of making a law explicitly on legal gender change arrived only at the end of 2000, when international institutions and the organization that took charge of fundamental rights started to make pressure at the global level to include gender identity in legislation. So in a certain way, up until the resistance of France that persisted up to 2016 was in a certain way endorsed by the threat that the medical community had posed regarding the approval of a law on gender recognition. And the fact that this procedure was in a certain way granted by jurisprudence in the 90s. How the recent changes will actually change the medicalization of legal gender change is something that is going to be studied in the future, because the application of the law is very recent, or even if there are already some signs of complications. And to take some conclusion out of, I'm sorry if I'm going out of time, out of all this discussion, we can say three basic things. First of all, evidently the different constellation of social actors that produced the two arrangements in France and Italy produced two arrangements that were actually apparently opposite. But in a way, in both cases, the legal gender change was medicalized because medical knowledge and technologies were included in the procedure for legal gender change. This, in a certain way, institutionalized a jurisprudence deference to science, as Jason would say, but in a certain way also show us how culture of law and science are mutually constitutive, because while in the case of Italy, evolution in law actually triggered transformation in the medical panorama, it was through the opposite in the case of France. As I think it was pretty clear in the presentation, we can see in both these examples how the medicalization of legal gender change was actually part of a wider apparatus that we could consider an apparatus of security that was aimed in a certain way to control a threatening phenomenon without repressing it explicitly, but through regulation and normalization. I'm sorry for running out of time, but...
Merci. Donc maintenant, on vous propose d'ouvrir sur cette présentation, selon si vous avez des remarques, questions, propositions. Et je propose de faire juste un tour, c'est-à-dire d'en prendre peut-être plusieurs s'il y en a, de faire un tour comme ça une fois. Tu veux commencer ?
Je vais bien commencer juste rapidement. Du coup, merci beaucoup pour ta présentation, pour cette histoire comparée, pour l'articulation médecine et droit, c'est hyper intéressant. Du coup, ma question, ce serait plutôt sur les mouvements sociaux et sur le trans-movement, enfin les trans-movements dont tu parles. Et du coup, est-ce que tu pourrais en dire plus sur le type de savoir, de connaissances, de ressources qu'ils mobilisent ? Et à quel registre ils font appel ? Est-ce qu'ils vont chercher plutôt dans les... Parce qu'il y a une littérature assez abondante que tu cites dans le papier, que je connaissais absolument pas. Mais est-ce que du coup, cette littérature, par exemple en SHS, en sciences sociales, a pu servir de point d'appui à ces mouvements sociaux ? Est-ce qu'il faut plutôt est-ce qu'il y a une fraction du corps médical qui était aussi qui a pu servir de point d'appui ? Est-ce que c'est du côté du droit plutôt que tout ça s'est passé ? C'est plutôt ce que sous-entend la partie sur les organisations internationales. Donc voilà, est-ce que tu peux dire un mot de tout ça ?
Oui, c'est une conversation. Marche ? Ouais. Ça y est ? Bon. C'est une conversation qu'on a déjà eue, mais ça fait rien, ça vaut la peine de continuer. C'est le statut de la comparaison entre Italie et France. Parce que dans ta conclusion, tu as insisté sur les voies différentes qui conduisent à un résultat de médicalisation. Et ma question, c'est, au fond, est-ce que c'est la même médicalisation? En particulier du point de vue des relations entre les médecins, le droit et, disons, les mouvements sociaux, etc. Parce que ce qui me frappe toujours dans cette histoire, c'est comment, dans le cas français, on a un parallèle extraordinaire avec les débats sur l'avortement en France et la façon dont la médecine a été centrale, à la fois en termes d'acteurs, donc de présence massive des médecins dans le débat sur l'avortement et des deux côtés, mais aussi dans le registre d'argumentation en faveur d'un changement de la loi. C'est-à-dire de recentrer l'ensemble de la discussion sur les conséquences sanitaires. Les conséquences sanitaires pour les personnes, les conséquences sanitaires pour l'ordre public. Bon, et donc, formuler autrement, la question, c'est là, est-ce qu'au-delà de cette histoire, la comparaison, elle nous dit quelque chose de plus profond sur le rapport entre médecine, droit et toutes les questions de reproduction dans les deux pays.
Je pars de cette dernière question. Et est-ce que c'est la même médicalisation? Je pense c'est non, pas exactement. Parce que ce qui frappe évidemment dans la comparaison de deux cas, c'est que dans un cas, la communauté médicale italienne est vraiment dégagée par rapport au débat, ça s'intéresse pas trop. Et ça se voit aussi dans le débat parlementaire. J'ai étudié les actes du débat parlementaire et au début, d'abord, ils font référence à beaucoup de référents étrangers, souvent, et en plus, le parlementaire n'utilise pas forcément un appareillage médical, même si c'est débattu, mais ce n'est pas le premier outil. En fait, c'est sur lequel je voulais insister pour les cas italiens, c'est que vraiment, au début, la manière dont la proposition de loi arrive dans le Parlement, c'est il faut régler une situation, là, il y a un petit problème, il faut régler la situation, mais c'est vraiment un truc tout petit. Et c'est juste après que le parlementaire de la démocratie chrétienne se rend compte qu'en fait, ce n'est pas une petite question. En fait, il part de cheval de Troie au moment où il se rend compte. Et c'est là qu'il commence à faire appel à la médecine, mais pas forcément comme source de justification, parce qu'il cite par exemple des sources différentes, des théories différentes de l'essiopathologie, du transsexualisme. Ce n'est pas forcément ça. La manière dont la médecine est évoquée, c'est surtout comme sous la forme d'agents des contrôles d'un phénomène qui peut être débordant d'une certaine façon. Donc la proposition de loi Rossi dit qu'il faut vraiment régler cette question et il faut régler la procédure. Et là, pour régler la procédure, il faut mettre quelqu'un à décider qui est le vrai transsexuel. Et donc la médecine est réappelée pour cette biais dans le dispositif. Alors qu'en France, c'est tout le contraire. Comme j'ai expliqué, en France, c'est la communauté médicale qui pose la question et qui dit qu'il faut construire une jurisprudence pour permettre ces changements d'état civil, mais il ne faut absolument pas faire une loi. Même si on regarde la question de l'extérieur, on pourrait se poser la question, mais c'était du fait que peut-être c'était un peu contre leur propre intérêt de ne pas approuver une loi, parce qu'en fait, le médecin qui faisait ce type d'intervention pouvait être accusé des crimes comme mutilation, castration, etc. Donc là, il considère la médecine comme... il considère la loi, la jurisprudence comme une espèce de prosécution du parcours thérapeutique. Donc la configuration, c'est très différent. Mais c'est sur lequel j'insiste, c'est que finalement, paradoxalement, ça revient sur un dispositif qui est très similaire, sauf pour un détail qui n'est pas un détail, c'est-à-dire le fait que en Italie, les modifications corporelles chirurgicales doivent être incluses, autorisées par les juges. Et donc, encore une fois, l'imbrication entre loi et médecine, c'est beaucoup plus étroite en Italie. Pour ce qui concerne les cultures du mouvement trans, je suis encore au début de la reconstruction de ce que c'était le mouvement trans en Italie. C'est vrai qu'il y a plusieurs référents dans leur discours. Le discours médical n'est pas complètement absent, par exemple, si on veut parler de ça, mais le discours des droits, en particulier des droits constitutionnels à l'expression de sa propre identité, etc., c'est quelque chose qui est beaucoup utilisé dans les discours de mouvement. Et aussi l'armamentaire discursif des droits civils, la liberté, etc., alors qu'en France, le mouvement s'est organisé de manière très différente et donc il n'y a pas besoin de mobiliser publiquement certains types de discours parce que ce que le mouvement fait, c'est surtout de provision de services, etc. Je m'étais parce que...